baby was 3 months old, there came the time of the opening of the gump, and after that, nothing was ever the same again. There was always excitement before the opening. In the harbour, the sailors made the three-masted ship ready to sail to the secret cove. Those people who wanted to leave the island started their packing and said their goodbyes, and rest houses were prepared for those who would come the other way. It was now that homesickness began to attack Lily and Violet and Rose. Homesickness is a terrible thing. Children at boarding schools sometimes feel as though they're going to die of it. It doesn't matter what your home is like, it's that it's yours that matters. Lily and Violet loved the island and they adored the new prince. But now they began to remember the life they had led as little girls in the shabby streets of North London. Do you remember the bingo halls, asked Lily? All the shouting from inside when someone won? And Saturday night at the Odeon cinema with a bag of crisps, said Violet. The clang of the fruit machines in Paddy's parlour, said Rose. They went on like this for days, quite forgetting how unhappy they had been as children. Teased at school, never seeing a clean blade of grass, and beaten by their father. So unhappy that they'd taken to playing in King's Cross Station, and they'd been there when the day opened in the gump, and couldn't go through in fast enough. They were desperate to get away. I know we can't go up there, said Lily, not with the prince to look after, but maybe their majesties would let us sail with the ship and just look at the dear old country. So they asked the Queen if they could take the baby prince on the ship and wait with him in the secret cove, and the Queen said no. The thought of being parted from her baby made her stomach crunch up so badly that she felt quite sick. It was because she minded so much that she began to change her mind. Was she being one of those awful drooling mothers who smother children instead of letting them grow up free and unafraid? She spoke to the king, hoping he would forbid his son to go. But he said, well, dear, it's true that adventures are good for people, even when they are very young. Adventures can get into a person's blood, even if it doesn't remember having them. And surely you trust the nurses? Well, she did, of course, and she trusted the sailors who manned the ships, and the sea air, as everybody knows, is terribly good for the lungs. So she agreed, and after a little weep in her room, and the nurses took the baby aboard in his hand-woven rush basket and its lace-edged hood, and settled him down for the voyage. Just before the ship was due to sail, the Queen rushed out of the palace, her face as white as chalk. No, 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 bring him back! I don't want him to go! But when she reached the harbour, she was too late. The ship was just a speck in the distance, and only the gulls echoed her tragic voice. We're going to switch now back to London and a different family, so it'll just be a little bit confusing for a while and then it all ties together. Mrs. Trottle was rich. She was so rich that she had 11 winter coats, 5 diamond necklaces, and her bath had golden taps. Mr. Trottle, her husband, was a banker and spent his days lending money to people who already had too much of it and refusing to lend it to people who needed it. The house the Trottles lived in was the best part of London, beside a beautiful park and not far from Buckingham Palace. It had an ordinary address, but the tradesmen called it Trottle Towers because of the spiky railings that surrounded it, and the statues, and the garden, and the flagpole. Although Lorena Trottle was perfectly strong and well, and Landon Trottle kept fit by hiring a man to pummel him in his private gym, the Trottles had no less than 5 servants to wait on them: a butler, a cook, a chauffeur, a housemaid, and a gardener. They had 3 cars and 7 portable telephones, which Mr. Trottle sat on sometimes by mistake, and a hunting lodge in Scotland where he went to shoot deer, and a beach house in the south of France with a flat roof on which Mrs. Trottle lay to get her suntan. It was not a pleasant sight. But there was one thing they didn't have. They didn't have a baby. As the years passed and no baby came along, Mrs. Trottle grew angrier and angrier. She glared at people pushing prams. She snorted when babies appeared on television, gurgling and advertising disposable nappies. Even puppies and kittens annoyed her. Then, after nearly 10 years of marriage, she decided to go and adopt a baby. First, though, she went to see the woman who had looked after her when she was small. Nanny Brown was getting on in years. She was a tiny, grumpy person who soaked up false teeth in brandy and never got into bed without looking to see if there was a burglar hiding underneath. She knew everything there was to know about babies. "You'd better come with me," Mrs. Trottle said, "and I want that old doll of mine." So Nanny Brown went to fetch the doll, which was one of the large old-fashioned ones with eyes that click open and shut, and lace dresses and cold china arms and legs. And on a fine day towards the end of June, the chauffeur drove Mrs. Trottle to an orphanage in the north of England, and beside her in the Rolls-Royce sat Nanny Brown, looking like a cross old bird and holding the china doll in her lap. They reached the orphanage. Mrs. Trottle swept in. "I have come to choose a baby," she said. "I'm prepared to take either a boy or a girl, but it must be healthy, of course, and not more than 3 months old, and I prefer it to have fair hair." Matron looked at her. "I'm afraid we don't have any babies for adoption," she said. "There's a waiting list." "A waiting list?" said Mrs. Trottle. "What? My good woman, do you know who I am? I am Lorena Trottle. My husband is head of Trottle and Blatherspoon, the biggest merchant bank in the city, and his salary is £500,000 a year." Matron said she was glad to hear that. Anyone lucky enough to become a Trottle would be brought up like a prince. Mrs. Trottle was not happy. She went on. "And this doll, I have brought this for the baby. It's a real antique. I've been offered a very large sum of money for it, but this doll is priceless." Matron nodded and said she was sure Mrs. Trottle was right, but she had no babies for adoption, and that was her very last word on the subject. The journey back to London was not a pleasant one. Mrs. Trottle ranted and raved. Nanny Brown sat huddled with the doll in her lap. The chauffeur drove steadily southwards. Then, just as they were coming into London, the engine began to make a nasty clunking noise. "Oh no, this is too much," raised Mrs. Trottle. "I will not allow you to break down in these disgusting Swallow streets." They were very close to King's Cross Station, and it was 11 o'clock at night, but the clunking noise grew worse. "I'm afraid I will have to stop at this garage, madam," said the chauffeur. They drew up by one of the petrol pumps. The chauffeur got out to look for a mechanic. Mrs. Trottle in the back seat went on ranting and raving. Then she grew quiet. On a bench between the garage and the fish and chip shop sat a woman whose frizzy red hair and long nose caught the lamplight. She was wearing the uniform of a nursery nurse, and beside her was a baby basket. A basket most finely woven out of rushes, whose deep hood sheltered whoever lay within. The chauffeur returned with the mechanic and began to rev the engine. Exhaust fumes from the huge car drifted towards the bench where the red-haired woman sat, holding onto the handle of the basket. Her head nodded, but she jerked herself awake. The chauffeur revved even harder, and another cloud of poisonous gas rolled towards the bench. The nurse's head nodded once more. "Give me the dog," ordered Latrina Trottle, and she got out of the car. For 8 days, the nurses had waited on the ship as it had anchored off the secret coves and gone back to the boats now with the prince and the nannies. They had sung to the prince and rocked him and held him up to see the seabirds and the cliffs of their homeland. They had taken him ashore while they paddled and gathered shell, and they had welcomed the people who came through the Gump as they arrived in the mouth of the cave. Travelling through the Gump takes only a moment. The suction currents and strange breezes there are stored during 9 long years, and they have laws of their own. Into the wind, baskets and people came, and they would be swooped into the land. It is a delightful way to travel, but can be muddling for those not used to it, and the nurses made themselves useful, helping the newcomers onto the ship. Then, on the 9th day, something different came through the tunnel, and that something was a smell. The nurses were right by the entrance in the cliff when it came to them, and as they sniffed it up, their eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Lily," said poor Violet, and her nose quivered. "Oh, Rose," said poor Lily, and clutched her sister. It was the smell of their childhood, the smell of fish and chips. Every Saturday night their parents had sent them out for 5 packets and had carried them back, warm as puppies, through the lamp-lit streets. "Do you remember the batter, all sizzled and gold?" asked Lily. "And the soft whiteness when you got through to the fish," said Violet. "The way the chips went soggy when you doused them with vinegar," said Rose. And as they stood there, they thought they would die if they didn't just have a taste of the glorious fish and chips. "We can't go," said Lily, who was the careful one. "You know we can't." Why can't we? Asked Rose. We'd be up there in a minute. It's a good 2 hours till the closing. What about the prince? There's no way we can leave him, said Lily. No, of course we can't, said Violet. We'll take him. He'll love going into a swaddlerette, won't you, my poppet? And indeed the prince cooed and smiled and looked as though nothing was bothering him. Well, to cut a long story short, the three sisters made their way to the mouth of the cave, climbed into a wind basket, and in no time at all found themselves in King's Cross Station. Smells are odd things. They follow you about when you're thinking about them, but when you put your nose to where they ought to be, they aren't there. The nurses wandered round the shabby streets, and to be honest, they were wishing they hadn't come. The pavements were dirty, passing cars splattered them with mud, and the Odeon cinema, where they had watched lovely films, had been turned into a bowling alley. Then suddenly, there it was again, the smell, stronger than ever, and now, beside an all-night garage, they saw a shop blazing with light, and in the window a sign saying, "Frying now." The nurses hurried forward. Then they stopped. "You can't take the prince into a common fish and chip shop," said Lily. "It wouldn't be proper." The others agreed. Some of the people queuing inside looked distinctly rough. "Look, you wait over there on the bench with the baby," said Rose, and was half an hour old. She was half an hour older than the others and often took charge. "Violet and I will go and get 3 packets. We're only a couple of streets away from the station. There's plenty of time." So Lily went to sit on the bench and Rose and Violet went to join the queue. Of course, when they reached the counter, the card had run out. Something always runs out when it's your turn. But the man went to fetch some more, and there was nothing to worry about. There was 3/4 of an hour before the closing of the Gump, and they were only a 10-minute walk away from the station. Lily, waiting on the bench, saw the big Rolls-Royce draw up to the garage, saw the chauffeur get out, and a woman with wobbly piled-up hair open the window and let out a stream of complaints. Then the chauffeur came back and started to rev up. "Oh dear, I do feel funny," thought Lily, and held on tight to the handle of the basket. Her head fell forward and she jerked herself awake. Another cloud of fumes rolled towards her, and once more she blacked out. But only for a moment. Almost at once she came round, and all was well. The big car was gone, the basket was beside her, and now her sisters came out with 3 packets wrapped in newspaper. The smell was marvellous, and a greasy ooze had come up on the face of the Prime Minister, just the way she remembered it. Thoroughly pleased with themselves, the nurses hurried through the dark streets, reached platform 13, and entered the cloakroom. Only when they were safe in the tunnel did they unpack the steaming fish and chips. "Let's just give him 1 chip to suck," suggested Violet. But Lily, who was the fussy one, said, "No, the prince only has healthy food and never anything salty or fried. He's sleeping so sound," she said fondly. She bent over the cot, peered under the hood, unwound the embroidered blanket, the lacy shawl. Then she began to scream.